Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive. Today, things are going to get a little controversial. We're tackling Jonathan Wells' book, Icons of Evolution. And just so you know, this book kind of shakes things up in the world of evolutionary biology. Wells takes aim at some of those classic examples of evolution, the ones we've all seen in textbooks and documentaries. And he argues that they're not as rock solid as we might think.
It's a really thought-provoking book. Wells doesn't just say evolution is wrong. He digs into the scientific details, the evidence, the interpretations, and he highlights where things get a bit, well, shaky.
So he's basically saying, don't just take these textbook examples at face value. Let's think critically and examine the evidence for ourselves.
Exactly. And he starts with a big one. The Miller-Urey experiment, that classic experiment that supposedly showed how life's building blocks, amino acids, could arise from a primordial soup.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one. The one with flasks and the lightning sparks, right? It's practically an icon of science itself.
Exactly, but here's the thing. Many scientists now think that the gas mixture they used in that experiment didn't accurately represent the early Earth's atmosphere.
Wait, so the experiment was flawed. But then why is it still so famous? Why do we all learn about it in school?
That's exactly the point Wells is making. It's become an icon, almost a myth. And it's often presented without any of the necessary caveats, which makes it seem like much stronger evidence than it really is.
Well, it's more about the image than the actual science. That's kind of troubling. Makes you wonder how many other scientific icons are out there that might also be based on shaky ground.
Which leads us perfectly to the next icon, Darwin's Tree of Life. We've all seen that image, right? The one with all life branching out from a single common ancestor.
Right. It's a beautiful image, elegant, simple. But then we have something called the Cambrian explosion. This is a period in the fossil record where we suddenly see this huge burst of diverse animal life all appearing in a relatively short period of time.
So it's more like an explosion of life than a slow and steady branching out. That doesn't sound very Darwinian. Exactly. And it's a real challenge for evolutionary biologists to explain. These complex animals just seem to appear out of nowhere, without any clear ancestors in the earlier fossil record.
It's like a puzzle with missing pieces.
It's more like a missing chapter in the story of life. And this raises some really fascinating questions. Did these animals evolve much faster than we thought? Were there earlier ancestors that we just haven't found yet? Or is there something fundamentally different about how evolution worked during that time?
Wow. So even something as fundamental as the tree of life is still open to debate and interpretation. Really makes you think. Speaking of things that might not be as straightforward as they seem, let's talk about homology. This is the idea that similar structures in different organisms, like a human hand and a bat's wing, point to a common ancestor.
Homology, one of the cornerstones of evolutionary theory. But Wells argues that the way we define and use homology can actually make it a circular argument.
Wait, how is that possible? It seems pretty straightforward to me. Similar structures, common ancestor.
That was Darwin's initial argument, yeah. But neo-Darwinists, who came after Darwin, redefined homology. They said that homology is actually caused by common ancestry.
So they're basically saying that the reason those structures are similar is because they share a common ancestor, which is why we know they share a common ancestor. That does sound a bit circular.
Exactly. It's like saying a car has wheels because it's a car. And we know it's a car because it has wheels. It doesn't really get us anywhere, does it?
Okay, I'm starting to see the problem here.
Yeah.
So if we can't rely on homology as solid proof of evolution, what are we left with? What's Wells's alternative?
Well, Wells suggests that instead of just assuming common ancestry as the explanation for similar structures, we need to look for independent evidence of that ancestry, evidence that's separate from the similarities themselves.
So things like the fossil record.
Exactly, or DNA comparisons. We could also study how those structures actually develop in different organisms.
It's like building a stronger case, right? Looking for multiple lines of evidence. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And speaking of building a case, what about those textbook images of embryos? The ones that are supposed to show how different species retrace their evolutionary history as they develop.
You're talking about Haeckel's embryos, a true icon of evolution, featured in textbooks for over a century. They show embryos of different species at different stages, and they're often used to argue that we all go through this fish-like stage in our development, reflecting our evolutionary past.
Yeah, I remember those images. They were pretty convincing. Made it seem like you could actually see evolution happening.
And they were incredibly influential. Even Darwin himself cited them as evidence. But there's a big problem. they're wrong.
Wait, what? You're telling me those iconic images are inaccurate?
Not just inaccurate, but deliberately distorted. Modern research has shown that Haeckel exaggerated the similarities between embryos, and he even omitted stages where they look very different.
So he was basically cherry-picking the evidence to fit his theory. That's not good science at all. It's almost like he was creating propaganda. But, okay, so those images of embryos are flawed.
Yeah.
But what about the fossil record? Isn't that solid proof of evolution? I mean, we have Archaeopteryx, the famous missing link between reptiles and birds.
Ah, Archaeopteryx. That feathered fossil with its reptilian tail and claws. It's been a star player in the evolution story for decades. But even its role as the first bird is being questioned now.
Hold on, are you saying that Archaeopteryx, the poster child for transitional fossils, might not actually be the ancestor of birds?
That's what many paleontologists are suggesting now. They think Archaeopteryx might belong to a side branch of the evolutionary tree, sharing some features with birds, but not directly leading to them.
Okay, that's definitely a twist. But it's still a feathered dinosaur, which is pretty cool. So if Archaeopteryx isn't the definitive link between dinosaurs and birds, how did flight actually evolve?
That's a question that's still hotly debated. There are competing theories about whether flight evolved from gliding ancestors in trees, the trees down theory, or from running and leaping behaviors on the ground, the ground up theory.
So were early birds little paratroopers? Or track stars?
Exactly. And that's where the fossil record, even with all its gaps and uncertainties, can offer some clues.
Makes sense. We can look for features in those fossils that might support one theory over the other. It's like a detective story. It seems like every time we uncover one layer of the evolution story, we find even more complexity. Are there any icons left standing at this point? Speaking of icons that have taken a hit, what about the peppered moth, that classic example of natural selection in action?
Ah, yes, the peppered moth. The story of how pollution in England darkened the tree trunks, giving darker moths a survival advantage because they were better camouflaged against predators.
It's a classic, a visual demonstration of evolution in action.
But as with some of these other icons, Wells presents evidence that challenges this seemingly simple story.
Wait, what? So the peppered moth story isn't as clear-cut as we thought. What's wrong with it?
Well, for starters, it turns out that peppered moths don't actually rest on tree trunks that often, which is where they were always shown in those famous photographs and experiments.
Hold on, you mean those textbook images were staged? They actually put the moths on the tree trunks for those photos?
It seems that way, yes, which raises some serious questions about those experiments.
Definitely.
And there's more. The decline of melanism, meaning the reduction in the number of dark moths, doesn't always correlate with the recovery of lichens on trees, which you'd expect if camouflage was the driving factor.
So even if the pollution goes down and the trees get lighter, the moths don't always follow suit.
Not always, no.
It kind of throws a wrench into the whole argument.
It does. And Wells points out that even some scientists, who were big proponents of the peppered moth story, have admitted that it's more complicated than we used to think.
So another icon bites the dust. This is blowing my mind. It seems like every time we look a little closer at these icons, the explanations start to unravel.
That's the beauty of science. It's not about clinging to dogma, but about constantly questioning and refining our understanding.
Well said. It's all about embracing the complexity. And speaking of complexity, what about those famous Darwin's finches? The ones with all the different beak shapes, the ones that are supposed to show evolution in action.
Ah, those Galapagos finches. They've become almost as iconic as Darwin himself. They represent this idea that natural selection can shape beak size and shape based on the available food.
It's like they're a living textbook of evolution.
Except it might not be quite that simple. First of all, those finches played a surprisingly small role in Darwin's initial formulation of his theory.
Wait, really? So Darwin wasn't actually inspired by those famous finches. But then why are they always associated with his name?
Their fame came later, largely due to the work of David Lack in the mid-20th century. He really highlighted the connection between beak shape and diet, which made those finches the poster birds for adaptive evolution.
So they became famous after the fact. Interesting. But does that mean the whole story about beak size and adaptation is wrong?
Not necessarily. But there's more to the story. More recent research, like that of Peter and Rosemary Grant, has shown that beak size in finches can fluctuate a lot in response to environmental changes.
So it's not just a one-way street of beaks getting bigger or smaller over time.
Right. The Grant's work showed that beak size can oscillate back and forth, sometimes even reverting to previous forms. It all depends on things like droughts and food availability.
Wow, so those finches are playing evolutionary ping pong. It's much more dynamic than just a simple story of adaptation.
Exactly.
And it highlights how complex evolution really is. With all these different factors interacting, it's like those finches are saying, don't underestimate the power of change and adaptation. Okay, what about those four-winged fruit flies? The ones that are often used to show how mutations can create new structures.
Oh, those are fascinating creatures. While they're often presented as an example of the creative power of mutations, there's a catch. Those extra wings don't actually work.
Wait, what? They have four wings, but they can't fly with them. That doesn't seem very advantageous.
Exactly. And that's precisely the point Wells makes. Those four-winged fruit flies are great for studying developmental genetics, but they don't really show that mutations can lead to functional beneficial changes, the kind that would drive large-scale evolution.
So those extra wings are more like a genetic glitch than a step towards some new design.
Precisely. Even Ernst Mayr, a very prominent evolutionary biologist, was skeptical of the idea that these kinds of drastic mutations could lead to viable evolutionary pathways. He called them hopeless monsters.
Hopeless monsters. I love that. It's like a reminder that evolution is more about gradual refinements than sudden leaps into the bizarre.
Exactly. Evolution is more of a tinkerer than a magician.
Speaking of tinkering,
Yeah.
what about those classic illustrations that show horse evolution as this neat progression from small, multi-toed ancestors to the large, single-toed horses we see today? It's a staple of evolution textbooks.
The classic horse series, it's visually compelling for sure. But Wells argues that those illustrations oversimplify the story, and they promote a particular view of evolution, that it's completely undirected and random.
Wait, you mean that horse series is pushing an agenda? How is that even possible?
Well, for one thing, we have to remember that the fossil record is always incomplete. We're working with a limited number of specimens, and there are many gaps in our knowledge.
So those neat linear progressions in the illustrations might not be as accurate as they seem.
Exactly. The fossil record is much messier and more complex than those illustrations suggest. And Wells points out that the idea of completely undirected evolution wasn't always the dominant view.
Really? So you're saying that some scientists actually believed that evolution had a direction, a goal?
Yes. In the 19th century, directed evolution was quite a popular idea, but it's later rejected by neo-Darwinists. They embraced the concept of random mutations and natural selection as the sole drivers of evolution.
So the horse series isn't just presenting a neutral sequence of events. It's actually promoting a specific philosophical view of how evolution works.
Exactly. And that brings us to a crucial point. Science is not immune to philosophical biases. The way we interpret evidence is often shaped by our underlying assumptions about the world.
So even in science, there's a human element, a subjective lens that shapes our understanding.
Precisely. And this leads us to what's perhaps the most iconic image of all, the image of human evolution as a linear progression from ape-like ancestors to modern humans. You know, that classic image on a line of figures, starting with a hunched-over ape and gradually becoming taller and more human-like until you reach the upright, modern human at the end.
Oh yeah, that image is everywhere. It's practically a cultural icon.
But are you saying we shouldn't take it at face value?
That's exactly what Wells wants us to consider. While that image is powerful and easy to understand, it drastically oversimplifies human evolution.
So you're saying it's more complicated than just a straight line from ape to human. But isn't that what the fossil record shows?
The fossil record for human evolution is incredibly incomplete, and the interpretation of those fossils is constantly being debated. We have a very limited number of specimens, many of which are fragmentary, and there's so many gaps in our knowledge.
So it's more like piecing together a puzzle with missing pieces than having a clear, unbroken chain of evidence. But what about those famous discoveries, like Lucy and the tongue child? Aren't those strong evidence?
They're definitely important pieces of the puzzle. The question is, how do all those pieces fit together? The relationships between different hominid species are still being debated, and there are many different interpretations of the fossil record.
So there's no single agreed-upon story of human evolution? Not exactly, no. And that's what makes it so fascinating. Wells argues that our desire to see ourselves as the pinnacle of evolution, the inevitable outcome of this long lineage, can actually cloud our judgment.
So we might be biased toward seeing a straight line from ape to human because it fits our preconceived notions about our place in the world.
Precisely. And this is why it's so important to remember the Piltdown man hoax, that case where someone created a fake skull to fit the prevailing narrative of human evolution at the time. It took decades to expose the hoax, and it shows how even scientists can be swayed by their biases.
It's like we're all looking for evidence to confirm what we already believe, even if that evidence isn't really there.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be skeptical, to question assumptions, and to be open to alternative interpretations.
This is making me realize that the story of human evolution is far more complex and nuanced than I ever imagined.
Absolutely.
It's not a simple linear progression. It's this messy and fascinating journey of discovery.
And that journey continues. We're constantly learning more about our origins, and each new fossil find has the potential to shake up our understanding.
This has been incredible so far. We've peeled back the layers of these iconic images and revealed a whole new level of complexity. I can't wait to dive even deeper in the next part of our exploration.
You know, as we're going through all these icons, it makes you wonder about the bigger picture, right? Is Wells ultimately trying to say that evolution is wrong?
That's a great question. It doesn't seem like he's totally rejecting evolution, but he's definitely challenging some of the core ideas, like the idea that random mutations and natural selection are the only things driving evolutionary change.
Right. And that leads to another interesting part of his book, his critique of the scientific establishment. He suggests that there's a kind of Darwinian dogma, that it pervades academia and education, and that this dogma makes it really hard for dissenting views to be heard.
So you're saying there's this unspoken rule that you're not allowed to question Darwin. But isn't science all about challenging assumptions and testing theories?
That's the irony. Science is supposed to be about following the evidence wherever it leads. But Wells argues that when it comes to evolution, there's a real resistance to questioning those fundamental principles of Darwinian theory.
It's like a secret cow or something. You can poke at it a little, but you better not try to dismantle it.
That's a good analogy. And Wells suggests that this dogmatic approach can actually hinder scientific progress. It can stifle critical thinking and open inquiry. If you're only allowed to look in one direction, you're going to miss a lot of what's going on.
Yeah, it's like wearing blinders. You might see a clear path, but it might not be the whole picture.
Exactly. And this brings us to another interesting point. You've probably heard the famous saying, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic. It's basically saying that evolution is like this universal truth, the key to understanding all of life.
Right. And that's exactly what Wells is challenging. He actually quotes Peter Grant in his book, you know, the scientist who did all that amazing work on Darwin's finches.
Oh, yeah, the Grants. Their research is incredible.
Well, Grant acknowledges that not all biologists actually see their work that way. They don't all view evolution as the be-all and end-all of biological understanding.
So even within evolutionary biology, there's room for different perspectives.
Exactly. And Wells argues that this insistence on seeing everything through an evolutionary lens can sometimes lead to oversimplifications and distortions of the evidence.
It's like trying to force a square peg into a round hole.
Exactly. And it brings us back to Wells's main message, really. We need to be critical thinkers. We can't just accept these icons of evolution at face value. We have to dig deeper and question the assumptions behind them.
It's a reminder that science is a process, not a set of beliefs. And those beliefs can change as we learn more.
Exactly.
This deep dive has given me a whole new appreciation for how complex evolution really is.
It's much more nuanced and messy than I ever imagined. And that's what makes it so fascinating.
Absolutely. It's a story that's still being written. And every new discovery has the potential to change how we understand that story.
So we've talked a lot about how Wells critiques these icons. He highlights where the evidence might be weak or misleading. But is he offering any alternative explanations himself?
That's a great question. Wells isn't necessarily putting forward a specific alternative to Darwinian evolution. He's more focused on raising questions, pointing out the areas where the current theory seems to fall short.
So he's more of a provocateur than a proselytizer. He's trying to get people to think critically, rather than offering a ready-made solution.
Exactly. He's like a detective.
Yeah.
Examining the crime scene.
Yeah.
Pointing out the inconsistencies, but he doesn't necessarily solve the case.
That's a great analogy. He's leaving it up to the reader to draw their own conclusions. So if he's not offering a specific alternative, what's the ultimate point of all this critique? What's he hoping to achieve? Well, it seems like his goal is twofold. First, he wants to expose the weaknesses he sees in the evidence for Darwinian evolution, to encourage people to re-examine some of those core tenets. And second, he wants to challenge the scientific establishment, to encourage more openness to dissenting views and to alternative explanations.
He's basically saying, hey, science is supposed to be about questioning everything, not just blindly accepting what we're told, especially when it comes to something as fundamental as evolution.
Exactly. And this speaks to a larger point about scientific knowledge. We often think of science as this realm of absolute truths, where facts are settled and unchanging. But the reality is that science is a process. It's constantly evolving, and our understanding of the world is always being refined, and sometimes even completely overturned.
So it's not about clinging to dogma, but about being open to new discoveries.
Exactly. Science is a journey, not a destination. And books like Icons of Evolution remind us that we should never stop questioning and exploring and challenging our understanding of the world around us.
It's like Wells is saying, don't be afraid to think outside the box, to question the textbooks, to explore alternative explanations.
Exactly. That's the spirit of true scientific inquiry.
Well, this deep dive has certainly challenged my own assumptions. I'm realizing that there's so much more to the story of evolution than I ever thought.
It's a story that's still being written, and it's one that I'm even more eager to explore now.
Wow. This deep dive has been a real eye-opener. We've gone deep into these icons of evolution, and it's amazing how much there is to unpack, even in those seemingly simple examples.
Absolutely. Wells' book really makes you think about science in a different way.
It's challenged my assumptions for sure. So after all this, after all this digging into the science and the philosophy, what's the one big takeaway you hope listeners will walk away with?
That's a good question. I think the biggest thing is this. Don't be afraid to question. Question what you think you know, even if it seems like settled science, especially when it comes to something as big and complex as evolution.
It's like even in science, there's no such thing as a truly settled fact, right?
Right. The history of science shows us that over and over again. Theories get challenged, revised, even completely thrown out as we learn more.
It's like that saying, the only constant is change. Applies to our understanding of the world, too.
Exactly. And being open to that change, to that constant refinement, is so important for scientific progress. Because if we get too stuck in our ways, too attached to those icons, we might miss out on new discoveries.
So it's not about rejecting science altogether. It's about, like you said, being willing to question, to dig deeper, to think critically.
Exactly. Science is all about that journey of exploration. It's not about having all the answers.
It's about asking the right questions. This deep dive has really made me appreciate how complex and nuanced evolution really is. It's honestly made me even more fascinated by it.
I know what you mean. It's like by showing us where things get a bit messy, by pointing out the cracks in those icons, Wells actually reveals this even richer, more fascinating story.
Yeah, like we've uncovered this whole other layer of the story. It's like that tapestry we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
This intricate tapestry that's still being woven with every new discovery, every new question.
And that's what makes it so exciting. We're all part of this grand adventure of discovery, trying to understand our place in this incredible web of life.
So well said. And books like Icons of Evolution are like these guides along the way, They help us stay curious, challenge our assumptions, and keep exploring those big questions.
Absolutely. And who knows what we'll find next? What new discoveries are waiting just around the corner?
That's the best part. It's an endless adventure. So keep those minds curious, everyone, and don't be afraid to ask those tough questions. And until next time, happy exploring.